To the past, and the ladies cross the ages, forward fathers from the motherland, whose lives are on the pages. And the bottle said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome one and all to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass and pull up a chair as we gather together here in our favorite corner of the Cross-Tyme Pub, wandering through the mists of time and the deep wilderness of the mind, as we often do. How are you guys doing? What's the weekend looking like for you so far? I hope it's nice.
Oh, so far so good.
It's a beautiful weekend, actually. I've got some catch-up homework to do. A lot of reading.
Yeah, I've been doing some reading. I've been catching up on a book. One of the earliest books on record, in fact, the Epic of Gilgamesh. I was going through, I've got this really nice scholarly annotated version of that, and it's incredible because there's the version that you may read in high school or even in college, and then if you really go through the scholarly interpretations and you look at the traditional Akkadian narrative of Gilgamesh, there's a lot of it that doesn't make sense. You know, there are references to words, Akkadian terms that may have multiple different meanings. In the modern context, we have a very hard time understanding, and you put that into context with what is already a fragmentary narrative, and it leaves an awful lot to the imagination. But it's beautiful because looking at the compilation of the Gilgamesh text, the primary narrative, which draws from different tablets and different sources, and of course, we probably, since this publication came out, the one I have, I think, is based primarily on scholarly work that was done with the known text at that time in the middle of 1980s. I'm sure there's a lot more to it now than there was at the time that compilation was put together. But even in its fragmentary presentation, you can get into the minds of ancient people so well when you study their way of writing and you look at the way that even this mythical narrative like Gilgamesh is presented. And it fascinates me for a lot of reasons because, of course, you've got, the references to the flood, the themes of love, friendship, immortality, or as Lovecraft would have said, man's attempt to reconcile with the horror of time, aging, all these kind of things, life in general. Much then at the time that the Epic of Gilgamesh was being penned is as it is today. And that's what I love about books. You sit down, you read a book, and it takes you away to a different place, a different time, a different way of mind, literally.
Yeah, it's a good escape. I think I've got it on the Kindle version of that. And I read it a couple of years ago. Pretty cool, really.
I've got, an entire bookshelf. I've got a big stack of books and journals and all kinds of things here. I just haven't had the time to read, and it's actually making me a little bit anxious. I know you guys probably understand where I'm coming from with that, but you got so much that you want to read, and there's only so many hours in the day. They're sitting here, and so what I'm trying to do this weekend is kind of quiet around the house. So I'm just trying to read, excerpts from each one, a little bit from this one, a little bit from that one, to try to get a feeling of accomplishment. But I do miss having the time to read, and the book stack's only getting larger as we're sitting here.
I've noticed as I've gotten older and I don't know, maybe just more tired, it seems like every time I sit down to read, after a couple of pages, I start to fall asleep. Is that going to happen to you guys?
Yes, James, it does. If at night I can't sleep, the number one way I will be able to put myself to sleep is if I start reading. And then there are other times, as we've discussed, guys, I've got kind of a biphasic sleep pattern where I tend to wake up in the middle of the night for several hours. In those instances, I will be trying to go back to sleep, and for whatever reason, my body's not having it, and so that's sometimes when I do my best reading. But generally, again, we're going to talk about Nikola Tesla a little later in the program. He was one of these, and his competitor, Thomas Edison, they were both the kinds of guys who could run off of about 3 hours of sleep at night. Edison, they said, didn't keep any kind of regular sleep schedule. He would lay down on a table. He had a cot stretched out in his workplace where he would lay down, stretch out, and he would sleep. Tesla, on the other hand, they said kept a schedule of about 10:30 in the morning until 5 a.m. the following day. And then he would lay down for a few hours, typically sleep no more than 3, and then get up and go at it again. That's another fascinating thing about these brilliant minds throughout history who seem to require less sleep than other people do. I don't know what it is, but yeah, coming back to your fundamental point there, James, yeah, there are times where, especially entering the first phase of sleep of the night, yeah, I read for a few minutes, puts me right out.
Out like a light.
You know, I've always found that if I wake up in the middle of the night and try to read, I can do it, of course, but then when I fall back asleep the next morning, I can't remember anything that I read.
We've talked
It's
about
one of those things.
Yeah, we've talked about some of the mysteries of sleep and how your mind approaches problems differently. Coming back though to the mystery of reading, that's another fascinating thing because if you think about it, and I often think about the Library of Alexandria, this being one of many instances, but probably the most famous in terms of large accumulations of knowledge that were stored and existed in the ancient world, which were lost to time. Carl Sagan wrote about it in Cosmos. Many archaeologists and historians have lamented the loss of that great library. But the idea that you take knowledge of the world and you condense it into a manuscript, and then you can store in like a book form, in a pamphlet or as a scroll, the many forms that books and texts have taken over time, but you can take that and you can create a lasting document that lives on beyond the life of the people and the exploits of those individuals described in that text or the writing of the narrator. Again, it's fascinating when you go back and you read Herodotus or any of the writers of antiquity, and you peer into the minds and the lifestyle of people in ancient times, and you notice two things, and guys, we always talk about this on the show. You notice two things, that one, things were much different, attitudes were very different, lifestyle, clothing, civilization in general, and the structures of societies, food, all different kinds of things were very different, and yet at the same time, fundamentally, to be human is something that has remained very consistent over the ages. Very consistent.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the Library of Alexandria, and I think every historian, every person interested in archaeology and anthropology and the human past is probably still lamenting the loss of that library. And something along those lines that was equally important were the Mayan codexes that were lost by the Spanish explorers who came in and destroyed most of those codexes. And on that note, have you guys seen this LiDAR discovery down in Guatemala of this vast new Mayan complex?
Absolutely. And in fact, some of the notes that I have included here for us to review today, I got to give props to our friend and listener, Adam Olson, who is often sending stories along to us and keeping an eye out for 7 Ages and what we're doing. So I want to give him props right up front for being one of the many who brought this to our attention. And like you said, just to preface this really quickly before we get into the recent discovery, as we're going to see, there's a lot more to the sprawling Mayan civilization, that innovations in technology that some have said are comparable to what the Hubble Space Telescope did for astronomy. LiDAR is doing this for archaeology, but coming back to what you just touched on, and maybe we'll get more into it later, Jason, the meeting of cultures in ancient times, again, with the Spanish explorers arriving, conquistadors, they approach the Maya, they see what they perceive as anti-Christian, pagan religion, or the equivalent to that, and it's destroyed. They destroy the vestiges of their calendar systems, their mathematical knowledge, their history, because they want to convert them, bring them over to Christianity. We lost so much knowledge. The most we can hope for at this point with these sorts of discoveries that we're about to dig into is to be able to reclaim some of that lost knowledge, which sadly was purposefully destroyed in the tragic meeting of cultures not very long ago, just a few hundred years ago. But I mean, talk about lost knowledge. Like you said, it's a beautiful transition, because whether it's burned in a library accidentally or intentionally destroyed because of differing values, belief systems, and the like, it's always a tragedy when knowledge is lost, which is why books are so important, why libraries are my favorite places, and why I'm so excited, like you say, about this temple complex. That not just a temple, I mean an entire civilization center that has been found in Guatemala. Go ahead.
That's a perfect point. And, it's this obsession, I think, that we have, especially in modern society, is wanting to fill those gaps. And when you're missing things like the codexes, when you're missing the knowledge that was in that Library of Alexandria, or even the fabled, Hall of Records that everyone still hopes exists somewhere in Egypt, it's wanting to be able to reconcile those ideas that we toss around about these different cultures and and maybe find some confirmation. What are we right about? What were we wrong about? What were we misinterpreting? And, this new site that they're finding down there in Guatemala is making us step back and reevaluate what we thought we knew about the Maya civilization. What we're beginning to see here is something on a much larger scale, entirely more vast than we had probably given it credit for in the past. And, this LiDAR, while it has been around for quite a while, it's now making archaeology more accessible. We're able to get into areas that before we would have never, had a clue about. And I can only imagine that this is going to continue to grow and develop as we move into the future.
Yeah, LiDAR is really kind of an amazing technology. It's another form of what's known as remote sensing. And I remember when I was in college, for geologists, it was great because it's able to penetrate through vegetative cover, trees and jungle, and you could see features of geology or features of topography that was impossible to see otherwise. And I mean, it's just it's a really cool thing. And you can even use it underwater. So there's a certain wavelength of light that they use from aircraft, and then there's a certain type of green laser light that they use to map underwater topography with.
Yeah, let's get into this just for a second. What exactly is light detection and ranging, otherwise known as LiDAR? BBC defines it as follows. It's a sophisticated remote sensing technology that uses laser light to densely sample the surface of the Earth. Millions of laser pulses are used every 4 seconds. They're beamed at the ground from a plane or a helicopter from above, and then the wavelengths are measured as they bounce back. It's not really unlike how bats use sonar to hunt or how existing radar systems would function, but the highly accurate measurements, BBC reports, are then used to produce a detailed three-dimensional image of the ground and surface topography. Now, some of the drawbacks, of course, that we see are while it gives us all kind of information about an area of the ground that we're talking about the dense remote jungles of Guatemala in this instance, this is not a very friendly location. Let me give you some perspective on this, in fact. Okay, there is a variety of snake that is known not only in parts of the Americas, but other parts of the world. Fer de lance, I think, is the name that is given to this extremely venomous viper. And when I was there, Jason, you probably experienced this too when you went down there to Lamani. I know we've both been to that site and certain other sites there that were part of the ancient Mayan complexes, but they warned us. They said there's a snake, okay? And in our language, it means 2 steps. And can you guess why this snake was called 2 steps? I'm sure you know.
Yeah. Is you can take about 2 steps before the venom's going to kill you.
Yeah, and the fer de lance is one of many pit viper snakes that they say, I mean, you do not want to meet this guy alone in the jungle where you're far away from being able to get help. And these are some of the many complex issues that make it difficult to be able to get out there and conduct ground-based archaeological surveys in these regions. With the LiDAR technology, we now know not only that there are archaeological sites and that the jungles of Guatemala and other sites presumably are rife with these, but they are much more far-reaching than we thought that we knew. But the downside is, too, that we're looking at roughly 3,000 years of Mayan civilization, and it's still going to require some degree of ground-based excavation and study and exploration, reconnaissance, and all this in order to be able to understand exactly temporally what we're dealing with within that 3,000-year window we're examining.
Absolutely. And as we continue to keep moving forward with this, we'll probably see advances in this technology, but with this Guatemalan site, it's so profound because, like I said, it's not like we've just found another small complex or, just a miscellaneous temple or village out in the woods. This is a massive, absolutely huge site. And to quote Thomas Garrison, actually, who's an archaeologist at Ithaca College, who's heading up this LiDAR project, he's also a National Geographic explorer. He's quoted as saying, "The LiDAR images make it clear that this entire region was a settlement system whose scale and population density has been grossly underestimated." So when we look at this, previously we had seen numbers around 5 million for the classical period. So that's 250 to 900 AD. That's about what they figured we were seeing with the Mayan civilization. However, after finding this discovery and sort of looking at the totality of the Mayan civilization again, they've bumped that number to 10 to 15 million for population. So, I mean, that's incredible. So what does that tell us about the Maya? Well, for me, it kind of indicates that maybe we don't know as much about this culture as we thought we did. And what we're finding here, when we say this site is huge and that this is probably one of the largest archaeological finds in recent history, we're talking about 60,000 houses, palaces, elevated highways, temples, pyramids that have been discovered in this area, over 800 square miles.
They are saying already that this is on par with some of the ancient antiquity that we know in Greece and Egypt, that indeed the Mayan civilization may have at one point been comparable to that, at least in size, and perhaps also in terms of technology, societal structure, a lot of different elements. And like you say, so much lost to time. We're having to really reassess what we thought we knew about Mayan culture and their civilization.
That's amazing. It's, the more that we advance technologically, I think it gives us a better window into the past. So the more we move into the future, the more we're able to discern the past. And we just keep learning things that we thought we had a pretty good handle on. We find out that we're completely wrong. And I know you guys have heard me say this before, but Jason, you were talking about the loss of the Mayan Codex. Sometimes when we have like a vacuum of information, we sort of, especially in these ancient civilizations that we don't really know anything about, some of the things that we think about them, or what we think we know about them, is really sort of a Rorschach test of our own personalities and our own civilization. We overlay on those ancient civilizations sometimes what we want them maybe to have been like, and then later we find out that they weren't like that at all.
And almost inevitably, something that comes to mind in relation to this discussion is the lost city of Z that explorer Percy Fawcett had famously searched for. David Grand wrote a fabulous book of that same name that discussed this and chronicled not just Percy Fawcett, but also many who came after him who went searching for a lost city complex somewhere out there in the jungle, presumably of South America. Here in Guatemala, we found something very similar, and it just stands to reason that with LiDAR in the coming decades, in fact, to quote one archaeologist that the BBC quoted, we'll need 100 years to go through everything before we will be able to find all of the things that LiDAR technology is now giving us new data about. We so often take for granted that we know this earth so well, and that we have explored even the dense jungles, and that we know the regions well enough, even though they haven't been charted completely. We know well enough the majority of the large animal species. We know well enough the city sites, the temple complexes, the locations of habitation over the centuries and thousands of years. But then we have something like this come out of the blue and completely upend what we thought we knew in terms of the vastness of a relatively more recent civilization like the Maya. And something that comes to mind about this, I may have brought this book up to you guys before, but Alan Weissman wrote a book a number of years ago called The World Without Us. It came out, I think, in 2007. Are you guys familiar with The World Without Us?
No, I don't think so.
Now, this book is really interesting because the premise of it, essentially deals with an Earth where if our infrastructure, for instance, in North America, were no longer upkept, how long before much of the evidence of civilization would just disappear and be reclaimed by nature? And I'm going to read very briefly here just to give a summary from the Wikipedia page about this. It's a book-length expansion of Weissman's own February 2005 Discover article, Earth Without People, written largely as a thought experiment, but it outlines, for example, how cities and houses would deteriorate, how long man-made artifacts would last, and how remaining life forms would evolve. He concludes that residential neighborhoods would become forests within 500 years, that radioactive waste, bronze statues, plastics, and Mount Rushmore would be among the longest-lasting evidence of human presence on Earth. And I can't help but think, of course, that we have Mount Rushmore today, but maybe an example of that from antiquity is the Sphinx in Egypt. But he looks at essentially, how quickly nature would reclaim the Earth. And in terms of going about our search for the ways, the lifestyles, the workings, and, of course, the proliferation in ancient times of these civilizations like the Maya, one thing I think we definitely have to take into consideration is that much can be reclaimed by nature, and we do need to utilize technologies intelligently and in new ways to explore the full vastness of what ancient cultures and societies were capable of. Again, this, as you said earlier, Jason, this LiDAR discovery in Guatemala, as it relates to the Mayan civilization, a landmark, but it's going to also be a game changer in terms of setting new precedents for the future of archaeological research.
Yeah, that's those are actually pretty good points about nature reclaiming things. There's lots of places where you can go, even in this country, where there were settlements and people lived along streams and in valleys or whatever that are now forest land or national forest. And you almost can't tell that anybody had ever lived there. Occasionally, you'll run across a hearth foundation for a fireplace, or some rock walls or some different things that people left up. But otherwise, there is no indication that people had ever lived there.
Sometimes I think even when you drive around your own town, if you notice a business that closes down within just 6 months, you begin to notice how weathered the building looks and how it just takes on that look as if it's beginning to fall apart. So there's a lot more maintenance. There's a lot more important things that goes into maintaining such structures. So I definitely see where you're coming from that. And I could see how nature could quickly reclaim a lot of what we have in the modern world.
And one thing I think people don't think about that often. Unfortunately, as a nerdy geologist myself, I think about it quite a bit. It was in the next ice age that we have, if the ice sheets come down as far as they did in the last glaciation, most of the major cities in the northern tier of the United States and in Canada will be completely erased from the earth.
See, I've always wanted to know what nerdy geologists think about in their spare time, James.
Yeah, we think about just, being rock hard all the time.
I bet. Yeah. In more ways than one, probably. Yeah, it is indeed fascinating. I don't know, man. I mean, you think about these earth changes and how much things can change over time, and the physical mechanisms that contribute to that kind of change.
Certainly. And one of those things that happens like clockwork here on planet Earth is magnetic pole reversals. Occasionally you'll see a story about an imminent catastrophe that has to do with the reversal of the magnetic poles, and the world's going to come to an end and everybody's going to die. Probably not. But we do know that those things happen periodically, around every 200,000 or 300,000 years. It's been about 700 or 800,000 years since the last one. And, North Pole and we know it's starting to wander around a little bit. Now, this is not something that happens overnight. It takes a few thousand years for it to actually come to fruition. And it has to do with the planet has an iron core that spins, and that's what generates our magnetic field, and it protects us from all the harmful things from space. So what would happen if the magnetic pole flipped? Well, the truth is, we're not 100% sure. However, mass extinctions and all of those doom and gloom things, probably not. I mean, we're all here now. We know these things happen a lot. One thing we know probably is true is that your compass needle, instead of pointing to the North Pole, will point to the South Pole as magnetic north.
Well, hold on, James. I want to ask something really quickly. I mean, with regard to what geologists know about pole reversals, we have had mass extinctions at different times in the past. There are some who are, again, maybe this is the gloom and doom component you're talking about, but there are people who are saying, hey, we may be due for another one of these magnetic pole reversals. Surely there's geological evidence that suggests what does happen when this occurs. I mean, so what do we know and what can we actually expect?
Well, like I said, other than the compass needle pointing to the south, we're really not 100% sure. We think that the magnetic field will get weaker. It won't go away, but the field gets weaker and stronger over time from natural fluctuations or whatever. It will probably affect our GPS satellites. It will probably affect animals that migrate that use the Earth's magnetic field to follow those migration patterns. And they may be confused for a while, but I think they'll probably sort it out. But we don't have any evidence that this actually causes any real geologic catastrophes or any type of extinctions or anything like that. So until we go through it, we don't really have good data on what the real effects will be.
Well, like many, we all have questions about this. If it were to happen, what would occur? National Geographic covering this largely in response to a lot of the discussion about it in the media going on right now. And this just from January. If geologic history repeats itself, they wrote, Earth's magnetic poles should eventually swap places. And that based on the magnetic fingerprints locked into ancient rocks, we know that over the last 20 million years, magnetic south and north have flipped roughly every 200 to 300,000 years. That's 200,000 to 300,000 year periods. The last of these, of course, as James stated, was about 780,000 years ago. And that means that we're a bit overdue for a total reversal. And some data do in fact suggest that a geomagnetic reversal is geologically imminent. But if it happens, again, we just, like you said, James, I guess we don't really know. They say that in the Nat Geo article here, the sluggish polar meander is good because it means we have time to prepare and can do our best to ameliorate any unpleasant effects before they get really unpleasant. But it's bad because our planet's magnetic field helps shield us from damaging solar and cosmic radiation, and a protracted flip means Earth might be slightly less protected from harmful space rays for longer than we would like. So if those kinds of conditions are worthy of consideration, and we do look at evidence in the past of everything from from dendrochronological data, i.e. tree ring data that shows that there have been periods of famine and things that have coincided with, if not pole reversals, any number of other things that affect crops widespread. You could have die-offs presumably occur in terms of, faunal species if the food sources are affected. And even though there may not be something that would directly affect animals on Earth, certainly you take away their food sources and there's a domino effect that occurs. So again, like we say, we don't really know exactly what's going on. It may not be anything. It would certainly be noticeable in a technological era as we currently exist in. But we, again, in terms of not knowing, it's difficult to kind of plan for or mitigate and have a proper response to potentials. Unlike, for instance, an impact with a meteor or something like that. We have a pretty good idea what happens when a large object slams into the Earth. And once again, technologically speaking, we're still, in terms of like Armageddon, as in the film Armageddon-style technologies that we would use to be able to neutralize an impending impact. I mean, we have an idea of what that does and how to try and deal with it, but we probably still are not quite technologically to the point where we can reliably offset the dangerous potentials of an impact. So, I mean, again, with all the different potentials for danger that these imminent events in the future, because much like a pole reversal, we can say that eventually an impact will occur again. It's happened countless times in the past. In fact, Earth is showered with small space rocks, most of them no larger than about the size of a grain of sand, and they burn up in the atmosphere quickly before they even reach the ground. But
right.
It's an imminent and eventual threat that must be considered, and something that we definitely want to try and gain as much knowledge about as we possibly can.
That's right. And it's something that's going to happen essentially in slow motion as far as humanity is concerned. It's not, an instantaneous catastrophe like an impact or, from an extraterrestrial object of some kind, but it's faster than plate tectonics. So I think like you said, we'd probably have some time to adapt to it and mitigate those effects if we could.
Absolutely. We were taking some time recently when the Seven Ages team went to Greenville, North Carolina. We visited an archaeological artifact show. And what was beautiful about this, as we'll be discussing in the next segment, was not only the representative artifact assortment that collectors from throughout the Southeast and other parts of the country, in fact, had brought to this location, but also the presence of historians, archaeologists, scientists who were there cataloging and interacting with this community. And it was one of those unique opportunities where the Seven Ages team, with our kind of intent and purpose to bridge the gap between those communities, we're actually seeing a little of that on the ground in the field, and we did live reporting from the event, as we will bring to you in the next segment here on the Seven Ages Audio Journal.
The team recently headed over to Greenville, North Carolina for an artifact show featuring a huge array of Native American artifacts from all over the Southeast. I know this is probably the first time either of you have been to an event like this in many years.
Yeah, it was just fantastic. It did remind me a bit of going to some of the rock and mineral shows that I used to haunt when I was a child. I think that truly geology was my first love. I was an avid rock collector, and my parents would always take us to any rock and mineral show that came through the area. But you would see at those shows, you'd also see a lot of fossils, and yes, Native American artifacts would turn up also, more recent artifacts, Civil War artifacts and things along those lines. Sadly, although I'm much more interested in this subject now than I was in my youth, I make less time to be able to do these things, which is one of the beautiful aspects of Seven Ages. We make a point to go out and to visit these shows. We made some new friends. We saw some exquisite collections. I think a high point of the entire day for me was talking with collector Don Ham, whose chronicling of not only North Carolina artifacts, but artifacts from other regions too. And also this information applied to what's known as Tennessee's Red Jasper culture, some beautiful books that have been actually co-authored by Don on this subject, all of that representative in his collection, and they're on display at the event. That was a huge turning point, really, and also a high point for me But the entire thing was just great. Getting to talk with collectors and archaeologists, share ideas, learn a lot of things about the past. We learned a lot of things from some of the folks there from Eastern Carolina University who were on site. So it was just altogether a great experience.
James, what did you think as a geologist seeing all those pretty stones?
Well, that was my first show, and I thought it was a lot of fun. Like Micah said, we met a lot of cool people. All the stones are cool. I mean, it was there's a lot of chert out there, man. You know, and it's hard to imagine what I guess life would have been like for for Native Americans or for Paleo Indians that they didn't have chert to use. Well, because it just lends itself so well to for tool making. But what I thought was interesting and really sort of surprising to me was how much knowledge the collectors and avocationalists had about Native American culture and Paleo Indian culture. It was more to it. It was much more robust, and there was much more depth than just like, hey, look at these cool points I've got. They actually knew, a lot about the cultures that lived in the areas where these folks actually collect their artifacts. I was really impressed. It was neat.
Yeah, it was absolutely a great show. It was very well organized, and I do want to take a second here to thank the organizer, Jimmy Boswell, for having us out there, allowing the Seven Ages team to be a part of this event and do the filming and the audio recording while we were there on scene. And also some of the professors and staff and students from East Carolina University who took time to talk with us and share their experiences and their knowledge. And it just made for a really great day. And we really appreciate everyone participating with the Seven Ages team.
Yeah. Of course, we were there live on the scene. We brought our entire remote recording rig, and we were doing some podcasting from the field and talking with some of the attendees. And so we'll get to the audio sound bites. First of all, our arrival on the scene there at the Greenville Lithic Show. Saturday, February the 10th, 2018, Seven Ages team here live at the Greenville, North Carolina Artifacts Show. I'll tell you, it's been a long time, guys, since I've been in a room with so much history and so many treasures. This is almost overwhelming for somebody like me who's still learning so much about all the different varieties of lithic technology from the ancient world.
No, it's always a good opportunity to come to places like that because there's always something you've never seen before. There's always a new face. Making excellent contacts out here so far today. As the day goes on, we hope to continue to get to talk to some more people. But so far, there's more than I can even take in. Just absolute treasures as you walk around this room. Really good showing today. Lots of the big-time collectors have come out, and we're seeing some fascinating and incredible lithic examples out here today for sure.
And the other fun thing, too, is this is an opportunity for Seven Ages to come out here into the field. We've got our table set up. We've got the entire remote broadcasting unit with us, and we're having an opportunity to talk together in this environment and also interact with and talk with people who are professionals. We've got professors from some of the local universities here. We've got lithic collectors, some people who have spent decades, 30, 40, 50, sometimes in some cases 70 years, according to some of the people we've spoken with, in the field collecting. And they've really made a life out of this passion for hunting for artifacts and for expanding their own knowledge of the ancient world. So it's really been a melting pot, not only in terms of the actual items we're seeing, but the people we're meeting too and their stories.
Yeah, this type of event is really great for networking and meeting people that would not normally listen to the show or would even know about the show. So I think it's really been good for that. And we talked to a couple of professors, archaeology professors, and one head of the department. I think Dr. Hughes and Dr. Randy Daniels, who's also the head of that archaeology department. So it's been really good. And like Jason said, there's just it's just absolute treasures in here. There's too much stuff to see, really. So it's a little bit mind-blowing, I think you could say.
Yeah, just pick out your favorite pieces and kind of concentrate on those. That's what I'm doing. I have 3 or 4 different types of lithic types that I really enjoy collecting. So I'm just going around and trying to spot those as they make themselves known. But yeah, there's probably no shortage of 10,000 or more artifacts in this room right now. Maybe, who knows?
I wouldn't hazard to guess. But I'll tell you, one thing that we see a lot in this room is, in addition to the actual stone tools, points, things like that, we see a lot of pottery. We see a lot of effigy pipes. In fact, there's one very incredible pipe in this room brought by Don Ham, a longtime well-known collector. This bird effigy pipe is arguably one of the most recognizable and famous in the world, and he brought it to this show. That was a huge surprise for the team. I don't think any of us expected to find that here.
Yeah, it's like meeting a celebrity in a way, except the celebrity is an ancient piece of stone. But I've seen this pipe so many times I never thought I would actually get to see it in real life, and I have to say it's even more impressive when you see it. The craftsmanship is unparalleled. It truly gives you some insight into the ability of these people as artisans, our ancient ancestors here in North America, and it really shows the capabilities of what they could actually do. Absolutely incredible.
Yeah, for those who may not be familiar with what an effigy pipe is, Jason, can you tell us a little bit about that, exactly what this represents? Often they feature the likeness of an animal or something along these lines.
Yeah, that's it exactly. You may have heard the term effigy again in association of like an effigy mound. So you're looking at a mound, be it ceremonial or a burial mound, that's intentionally shaped into a particular animal or shape, like we often talk about the serpent mound on Seven Ages. It's in the shape of a serpent, therefore it's an effigy. The pipes are no different. So, smoking of the pipe was a big cultural attribution of these early people, and therefore they would often fashion these pipes into various shapes. It could be a wolf, could be a duck, could be a turtle, just anything that was meaningful to them has a culture. And when you see the ability for them to actually be able to carve it out of a solid piece of stone like that, it's absolutely incredible.
It really is. And again, this one is just breathtaking, but it's not the only thing that we've seen. I mean, again, collectors from all around the region, and actually in some cases, all different parts of the country. We've seen some beautiful pieces from the Illinois area, Midwest, even further west than that, California, Montana, all kinds of things. You never know what you're going to find when you come to a show like this. And a lot of people who go to different kinds of trade shows, you'll often find arrowhead collections, but to come to a conference that is dedicated to the study of these, and of course there are a lot of academics here present today too, who are coming to help catalog and try and learn more about the past for the very same reasons. This is, again, it's just a treasure trove represented in this room today, and of course for guys like us, well, we're like kids in candy stores.
Yeah, one thing about it is you can really tell there's a community of these people, these collectors. There's a lot of hey, it's good to see you again type thing, and a lot of smiling faces in here. So, there's an archaeological part of this, obviously, with all the lithics, but there's a kind of a cultural thing that goes on here, modern culture. And this is like a subset of American culture that not a lot of people get to see very often.
Absolutely. And that's why, of course, we brought the Cross-Tyme Pub with us. It travels where we go, kind of like a TARDIS, but in reverse. So it's good to be here. And I'm sure we'll be sitting around the table, pouring up some pints, at least if nothing else in the proverbial sense. It may actually have to be coffee here in the conference room. But we'll be chatting it up with a lot more people throughout the day as we provide updates on our experience here in Greenville at this beautiful artifact show. One of my favorite people that we met over the weekend was Professor Charles Yuen, who is a historical archaeologist, professor in the anthropology department there at Eastern Carolina University. Charlie came over and spent a good amount of time talking with us, and of course sat down on the microphone also, as you're about to hear. But one of the things that was so fascinating is that it echoes throughout this community the necessity for getting the dedicated amateurs, the avocationalist archaeologists, and the academicians working along with the collectors too. I really make a distinction between the amateur archaeologist who is involved in field work in many capacities, making new discoveries, but also trying to collect and put scientific processes behind this, and often providing important information to professional scientists in terms of archaeological work. But then also the collectors who are more in this in terms of, and there are a number of things. Many people are just fascinated with the past. Many people engage in collecting so that they can also deal, trade, or sell some of the artifacts that they find. And this aspect of the work of collectors is often frowned upon by the academicians. And in fact, one of the stories that we're told involves a group of collectors who had fallen out of favor, I guess, with one particular professor who led a raid of that person's property, and they actually removed some of the artifacts. This is the kind of thing you would never hear about these days. But it underscores, I think, the broader history of a kind of divisiveness between collectors and professional archaeologists. And so Dr. Yuen sat down and talked with all of this, as well as the advocacy work that he's done, which involved one popular American television program and its involvement with archaeology. We'll hear that with Dr. Charlie Yuen in this next segment. 7 Ages here at the Greenville Artifact Show, and we've got a special guest joining us in this segment, Dr. Charlie Yuen, professor at ECU. I know you've got a background in anthropology and education, but you do an awful lot with archaeology too. Would you tell us a little about it?
Well, archaeology is one of the subfields of anthropology, so I teach archaeology classes at East Carolina, and I'm a historical archaeologist. That's my focus in archaeology.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of history in archaeology and vice versa. One thing that was so fascinating when we were talking with you earlier was your involvement in petitioning. There was a television program. Could we talk about that a little?
Yeah, I was. I'm the past president of the Society for Historical Archaeology, and while I was president, the National Geographic Channel had a metal detecting show called Diggers.
Right.
And it appeared that they had these metal detecting guys looting sites and selling the artifacts that they found, and so all of our members were outraged, and we sent a letter to National Geographic saying, what's going on, guys, and they were surprised, and so they had a meeting at their headquarters in Washington. We all came down and had a discussion. There were metal detectors, there were archaeologists, there were historians, and it turned out that they had never really sold any of the artifacts, and they always had permission. And I said, well, that's something that we'd like you to see make better known, and how to be a responsible collector and that sort of thing. So instead of protesting, what we opted to do was actually work with the production company, and they actually did something that I never thought they would do, that they would do rough cuts of the show, and then they would let us preview them.
Oh, wow.
And make comments, and oftentimes they would change things that we thought weren't really good archaeology or ethical. And in fact, they ended up hiring an archaeologist to be on camera. And so, it's a show that I'm sure most professional archaeologists would ever sit down and, mark on their calendar to watch. But it was something that we didn't object to at the end. And in fact, I think it reached a lot more people than certainly anything that I could put together.
Well, it's so inspiring, as I was telling the guys earlier, because, playing that active role as an educator and bringing a more, I think a better representation of the archaeological side of that, even in a format where it's largely entertainment like that.
Well, there's something called edutainment, and that's kind of where this is. But one of the comments that one of my former professors had made, and that's certainly applicable here, is that more people will watch 1/2 hour of that show than will read everything that I've ever written.
Yep.
So, and that's pretty powerful when you can, reach all that. I've done some shows on the History Channel too, and a lot of my colleagues are very skittish about doing that, and I don't blame them, because sometimes they edit it so you really look foolish. But I think it's a chance that we should take, in that we're going to reach people that we would never reach otherwise.
Professor Yuen, it's no secret here at 7 Ages that one of our main goals is to bridge the gap between the academic community and the collector. And being that we're at an event like this today, surrounded by such extensive collections, can you speak to your experience as dealing with the collector from the academic standpoint, and how do we continue to bridge that gap?
And it's a difficult one, because there's a lot of buying and selling of artifacts going on here. And if there is one rule for the professional archaeologist, it's that you don't traffic in artifacts, or really consort with those that do. And so that's problematic. And but most of these collectors are collecting because they're interested. And they're very interested in what they do. In fact, I know many archaeologists that got their start as kids collecting arrowheads in fields and things, and then they want to know more, and then that's what led them into their career. Most of these folks aren't bad folks, and if they can, actually, they're usually really excited to work with an archaeologist when one talks to them. So, and there are so many more of those guys than there are of us, that if we're going to find sites and know where the distribution of things are, we have to kind of reach out to these folks. But it's a fine line to walk.
It is.
Absolutely. What would be your advice to someone who's just coming into the world of collecting from the academic standpoint? How can they better serve to help you in your daily job?
Well, one of the things that I always tell my students and folks here is that there's a state archaeology society in every state. Join that. They're always incredible bargains. You get a journal, and it's never more than $20 or $25 a year. But they have meetings, and at the meetings, professional archaeologists go and they may present papers, but they can be like flies on the wall. And honestly, and I was at University of Arkansas before I came here, working with the Arkansas Archaeological Survey, and we had a society dig every year where amateurs could come and dig with professionals. In fact, we're starting that here. We're going to have a day where I'm running a archaeology field school down at Brunswick Town. It's a colonial port site just south of Wilmington. And on June 2nd, you can dig like an archaeologist. And it's you sign up, pay a fee, you come down, you get the tour, the lecture, and then for a couple hours you work with my students, digging and sifting and doing everything an archaeologist would do. So,
That's such a great way to get people, especially young people, involved. That's one thing that keeps coming up as we're talking with the collectors and some of the academics here on hand today. Wow, look at this. We really want to try and get more young people involved and interested in archaeology, whether it be collecting or studying, learning, and of course, obviously involved in fields where archaeology can be applied practically as a profession.
And it's something, some archaeologists, sometimes we're our own worst enemies as far as getting people interested. I mean, let's face it, being an archaeologist, for a lot of folks, could be the coolest job on the planet. It's even in Star Trek, Captain Picard wrestled with, do I go to Starfleet Academy or stay being an archaeologist? And so I mean, it is a cool thing, and then we squander that by, trying to make it as dull as possible, and it isn't. It's I still love it after all this time.
Well, for us, I think we can speak to that. There's nothing dull about archaeology, and certainly nothing dull about this conversation. Again, we appreciate you, your presence here as an educator, and of course, sitting down and talking with 7 Ages today.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
So in this next segment, we share our thoughts on the relationship between avocationalists and academics in the archaeological world. And it was pretty interesting because we actually got to see the two interact in the same space at the same time. And I don't think that happens very often.
Maybe it happens more than we realize. I think that the end goal for all participating here is we want to see it happening more, which is all the more reason it was such a unique setting for 7 Ages to be able to participate. 7 Ages here at the Greenville, North Carolina Archaeology and Artifact Show. What an interesting time this afternoon. I got to tell you, some of the things that we've seen, again, we already mentioned it in that earlier segment, but the bird effigy pipe that Don Ham, legendary collector, brought with him. Guys, this has just been incredible. And one of the big things that's on the table, this has come up in so many conversations we've had today, we're trying to bridge this gap between the collectors and the academics. We've got academics who are here actually cataloging some incredible finds, a lot of collectors who are actually selling things, some discussion with historians like Dr. Yuen, who we spoke with, who are saying, the academics, they don't want to be caught, collecting or doing anything like that. The collectors, they don't want to give their stuff to the academics. And part of what this show does is we're bringing people together. Not us specifically, although we're trying to do that, 7 Ages also, but the people who are orchestrating this event, they're saying we want to try and bring people together and bridge that gap between the collecting and the academic community.
Yeah, we did have an opportunity to speak with some of the organizers of the event, and we were extremely happy to see that was their intent, is they feel the same way we do here at 7 Ages about bridging that gap between the academic community and the collector. When you get it right and those two can respect one another and work together, you end up exponentially increasing your knowledge, because as we know and as we see here today, there are far more collectors than there are people working in these academic fields. So, these are the people with the majority of these treasures and majority of these artifacts. So when they can learn to depend on one another and trust one another, it's going to reflect in the research, and we're all going to move forward with our knowledge about the past.
Yeah, like Dr. Ewing said earlier, there's far more collectors than there are archaeologists or academics, and really, I think he sounded like he was the kind of guy that appreciated that there was really a need for them to bridge that gap, and it'd be beneficial for everybody instead of just having these two camps, diametrically opposed to each other, really unnecessarily. Collectors, one thing, and we've heard this all weekend actually, is they're afraid that if the academics find out that they have some kind of artifacts on their property, or there's when they till their fields, there's points come up if they find out, they're going to come and take it or confiscate their land or whatever, which is not true at all. I mean, that's not true. But it's just some myth or some wives' tale that just does not seem to die.
People who actually think that through processes like eminent domain, if there's something of significance found on their property, that the government may come and try and take their land. Now, we did hear one very interesting story that was shared with us by an individual here at the event, and this, again, was not some sort of a make-believe story or wives' tale. It was a group of academics that had actually forcefully entered a person's house and did take some artifacts, but this was decades ago, and he was making the point that this was a horrible example of how we bridge the gap between these communities. We want to foster a good relationship between collectors and people who are academics who are trying to study, because, again, you come to an event like this, you never know when you're going to walk into a room like this with so much representation from different periods in time and all these artifacts. You never know when you're going to find the next big discovery that's going to rewrite everything that you thought you knew about some aspect or area or period in history.
Yeah, and literally, as we're sitting here right now, we have someone from East Carolina University to my right. He's here documenting various points that are being brought to him for his research by amateur collectors. So literally, as we're sitting here recording this podcast right this very moment, knowledge is being expanded and being shared between those two sides of the camp. So it's a fantastic thing to see. I hope as we move forward that people recognize that is truly at the center of the goals for 7 Ages Research Associates. And we truly are, I think we've made some really good connections here today, and people are understanding that we can represent both sides of the house, the academic side as well as the amateur collector. But again, we're seeing people here today who have been collecting 40, 50, sometimes 60 years.
It's incredible.
And so they have a vast amount of knowledge, and you think if you take someone who's developing a report, someone who's writing a paper, someone with that type of experience who can literally guide you to a spot and tell you this is where the last 40 years of my life has been spent collecting, and here are the artifacts. You got to think about how much knowledge can be gained for everyone's benefit.
Certainly.
When those two sides work together, and that's what we want to do at 7 Ages.
That can't be discounted. As a matter of fact, it's funny you say that. I was on the other side of the room early this morning, and there was I overheard an elderly gentleman say he had been collecting for 75 years.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's amazing.
I mean, most people are lucky to live 75 years.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really been a way of life for these people, but the importance of getting the aspects of the archaeological community that seem to kind of exist in their own little separate universes, getting these different areas together, getting the representative communities to share information. This is how archaeology moves forward. This is how discoveries are made, and this is how we preserve the past. And really, that's as much a part of what we as 7 Ages are trying to do as I think anybody in this room. It's so great to see a group come together with all of this in mind.
Yeah, it's always better when we share information and openly and with more transparency. That's the only real way to move forward.
Yep, I agree. So at this point, we're about halfway through the show. We've got a couple hours left. We're hoping to get a few more interviews for everyone to hear, and maybe go find a few more of these archaeological treasures before we wrap it up today.
That and some delicious cuisine from here in Greenville, North Carolina. 7 Ages on site, on duty. And for those who are not already following us on YouTube, if you'd like to see a video featuring that last segment, we have that over on our YouTube channel. You can also find that at our website, 7ages.org. And while we're throwing out all of the necessary links to be able to find us online, be sure and also check us out on Twitter, and you can also find us on Instagram. We also have a Facebook page set up. Just look for 7 Ages Research. You'll be able to find us at all of the requisite mediums by doing so. And of course, we also have from time to time listener emails that we feature on the program, and we have one this week from Lonnie who says, Micah and crew, big fan of your work, and I started listening to you when you joined another favorite of mine named Jim Harold, also a fine podcaster and friend of ours. He said, I'll say of all your work, I may be enjoying 7 Ages the most. I suppose due to the content premise being amongst my favorite topics. And so my question, which I'm hoping you guys will address on 7 Ages, or you can email, I recently purchased a Gaia subscription, and I'm familiar with Greg Braden. But of the shows I've watched so far, his show Missing Links has even my wife fascinated. She normally dislikes these kind of topics. What's your opinion on his work and the content of his show, if you'd care to share any of that? And I, like you, am cautious and skeptical, but man, I do love hearing new thought processes. Some of the discoveries seem hard to dispute, particularly Season 1, Episode 4. Thanks, Lonnie Lewis, West Alexandria, Ohio, and former North Carolinian. So glad to hear from a former North Carolinian. Lonnie, I hope we get up there to your part of the woods again in Ohio. That's one of our favorite regions, archaeologically, the team and I. As far as Greg Braden, I'm peripherally knowledgeable, I guess, at least in terms of missing links and the kinds of things he talks about on there. I think that Greg also handles sort of a spiritual side of this too. As far as, for instance, and I don't want to speak for the entire team, maybe I'll throw it to you guys here in a moment too, but I mean, in terms of the way that we approach it on this show with Seven Ages, I mean, we are, I think it's fair to say, strictly historically and archaeologically and scientifically motivated in the way that we go about these things. But I also think that I can speak to some of what, for instance, people like Greg talk about in relation to that spiritual dimension of being interested in this subject. And I know especially Jason can relate to this. When we get out and we are in a creek and we're looking for fossils or relics, and James, you just talking about wanting to get out and do some of that down there in Savannah where you are this weekend, there is this kind of a state of mind, a peacefulness that comes over you when you are in the natural element and you're involving yourself in looking for beautiful relics or artifacts from the past. I do know that we've talked about this sometimes on our long car rides between locations, that there's a very spiritual quality to that each of us feel too.
No, there absolutely is, and it's almost therapeutic in a way because when you're out there on the hunt and you're looking for whatever it is, you're immersing yourself in nature. But I like to turn the phone off. I just like to leave all that behind. Just get out there and be in nature and just enjoy it and just relax. And for me, I always find, if I'm stressed out, if there's something on my mind, I can just go out into the creeks. I can go out into the forest, even walk in a plowed field. There's just something therapeutic about being outside, moving along, and having the possibility of finding one of these archaeological treasures. And I've talked about this before in the past with you guys. Anytime I do find something, be it fossil, be it artifact of any sort, I always like to take a few moments before I ever even touch it to just take the moment in, reflect on it, and appreciate it, because many times you're touching something, in the case of a fossil, that no human being has ever touched in millions of years. And with the case of artifacts, you're touching something that's been hundreds or thousands of years since the last human being ever had that in their hand. And to me, that's always been something special. And I know, as we were at the artifact show, that I know those people who have those collections and those people who covet those things so closely, they understand that, and they understand that connection that you have a lot of times with a certain artifact. You guys all know I have a couple of my collection that I'm extremely fond of, and I feel almost connected to in a way because of the circumstances and the way that they were discovered. They have great meaning to me, and it definitely is spiritual. It definitely is therapeutic.
Just being outside in nature, like you were saying, I've always found it to be very grounding. Just being outside, it's just, you get away from worries of the day or, what you've got going on in your life, and you just sort of like reconnect with the earth and, sort of get your mind right. And I always, like you said, I've never actually found any type of artifact or anything, but I found lots of fossils. And sometimes when if you kind of crack a rock open and there's a fossil inside or whatever, there's a moment there where you go, this has not been exposed to the light of day in 100 million years. And then here you are with this, with this thing in your hand. And it's very, it's almost sort of like a sacred feeling, I guess you could say.
Now, I have to dispute when you say that you've never found an artifact, because, when we were all working together on a dig down in Aiken, South Carolina recently, even though they may not be like a fully formed point or a piece of pottery, we found plenty of shards of pottery and lots of lithic debris, which are every bit as much indicators of the presence of people in ancient times. The flint chippings. We found broken portions of 2 points during that excavation that we were working on, the Seven Ages team, in a very controlled environment. By the way, it wasn't us just getting out there and haphazardly digging or something. This is something that's very important to point out, that many of the state archaeological societies and the boards, they of course want you to report when you have found any kind of evidence of early human habitation at a location, a site of archaeological significance. They do not advise that you go and you dig at these kind of sites. Unfortunately, we can't name the location, but this is on private land. We had full permission to be able to be there. And this is a site that, in truth, many would call it looting, but collectors have gone out there and just absolutely just taken this place over the years. And so, unfortunately, it's a site that really has already been widely dug. But we spent time there trying to assess the area and learn about the presences that may have been there over the years. And again, the Seven Ages team trying to responsibly go about our acquisition of knowledge about the past at this location. The landowners graciously allowed us to do so. It is a shame that by the time we arrived, it wasn't something that could be preserved in such a way that we could bring in academicians who could apply proper methodological approaches to learning about this sort of a site. And unfortunately, there are many other sites we know of that there is an academic presence, and these are current undergoing digs which archaeologists are overseeing. So keep in mind, if you find evidence of something, one thing Seven Ages likes to try and do is provide a medium between, as we discussed in some of the sound bites that we heard there, these areas where if you find something of significance, but you're afraid to tell somebody because you don't want them to come in there and claim your land, like Dr. Charlie Yuen was talking about, they're not going to come in and take your property. But sometimes what you may have on your property or something that you may find could be of great significance. And if the proper channels are followed and you get the proper academicians involved, I mean, you may be able to lend to knowledge of the ancient past that brings all new discoveries about the ancient way of life. And this is so fundamentally important. So again, part of what we try to do as Seven Ages is to look at those aspects of what is found, who finds it, and bringing this to the attention of the academic community. You don't want to go out there and haphazardly just start digging on somebody's property. And you certainly don't want to do it on federal land. If you actually do this in a national park, there are ordinances. You can be put in jail for removal of artifacts and the like from federal land. So you got to be very careful about that. By the same token, though, I'm a big fan of the idea of if you have permission to walk on a plowed field, an area that's been, I mean, the soil's been turned, and in likelihood, it's not going to be a place where an archaeological dig can be carried out. But if you have the permission of a landowner and you want to get out and you want to look for artifacts, find points and things like this, arrowheads, I love that. I think many of us who are involved in this enjoy that aspect of it. And I do encourage other people to, in a proper way with permission and on land where you can do so legally, get out there and learn about the ancient past and get yourselves involved. But James, you did definitely find some evidence of, they may not have been fully formed points, but they definitely were artifacts nonetheless.
Well, you're right. I had kind of discounted that or forgotten about it, I guess. I tell you, the part that I was especially excited about when we did that dig was when we uncovered that 1990s era soda bottle in the one corner of the excavation there.
I was thinking about this the other day, and I got to give you one more anecdote, and then we'll get to our final segment where we discuss the rivalry and one of the most famous of all time that occurred between Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison. But I did some walking alongside the river yesterday, in fact, guys, right here in Asheville. And as I was walking along, I was seeing probably bottles, portions of tires, and other, again, artifacts of far more recent provenance. But nonetheless, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, if I spent enough time, if I dug around, if I spent a whole week out here on this little sandbar, I would find evidence of earlier cultures. That's a little harder to find. A lot of these technologies don't last the test of time. In fact, plastics probably won't either. In truth, stone is the one that really will last, I mean, thousands and thousands of years. But, I mean, archaeology applies to every era. And there are archaeologists who study 100 years ago rather than 1,000 or 10,000 years ago. I mean, every era in human history is fascinating, and the eras prior to the arrival of humans on this planet. So, you know, we're fascinated with the past here at Seven Ages, and I definitely want to thank Lonnie for writing in and sharing your thoughts. And, of course, anyone else out there who would like to do so, there are a variety of ways that you can reach us. But I think the simplest way to do so is you can email us at our names, Jason, Micah, or James, at sevenages.org. That way you can direct an email to any one of the three of us specifically. And, of course, also there's a catch-all, info at sevenages.org, that we utilize for the website as well.
Well, guys, we're having a lot of fun here on episode 005, and we got one more segment to cover here on the Seven Ages Audio Journal. One of the fascinating things about history, and gentlemen, I'm sure you will agree with me,
are the colorful personalities that emerge, the people whose names end up on the pages of history books. And of course, to be able to have that kind of charisma, naturally, there's got to be a bit of ego. But when you pair ego with ideas and the collision of attitudes over time, you got disputes.
I challenge you to a duel.
Now go away or I shall taunt you a second time. Go get.
Famous feuds.
The famous feud we're going to be exploring today exists between Thomas Alva Edison and Nikola Tesla. Now, this is probably one of the more famous feuds, being that both of these guys, Edison being an American inventor and a businessman, Tesla being a Serbian-American inventor, electrical engineer, mechanical engineer, and even a physicist. These two, started off with a working relationship at the beginning, but slowly as they began to work on opposing sides and inventions, it led to one of the most famous and notorious feuds in modern history.
Let's start with Tesla's arrival in New York. He arrives, he's broke, he's got the clothes on his back, he's desperately in need of work, and of course you've got one of the most brilliant minds of the last century. Well, actually the last 2 centuries, because his arrival, of course, occurring in 1884, he arrives in New York and he immediately wants to seek out Thomas Edison and try and find employment. Now keep in mind, setting the stage here, that at this time, Edison had been working hard to implement direct current, and naturally, this actually leads to how J.P. Morgan, for instance, gets involved in this entire race of innovation, because wanting to be the first kid on the block, he has electrical via direct current, electrical lighting installed in his home. But in order to be able to do this, the dynamo that's in his basement is so loud that his neighbors are complaining. They say that, it rocks the windows. Our entire house rattles. So he has to have great big rubber mats put in place where he can lift the dynamo up onto this, of course, have his servants do this. And in fact, speaking of those engineers on staff, those that were serving his electrical needs, in order to be able to have the power without the downtime that was prevalent with the direct current systems in their infancy as they were, what we also have is a staff of engineers that from 3 p.m. to around 11 p.m. every single day are on staff at J.P. Morgan's house. This was a highly inefficient system. We also had Mrs. Cornelia Vanderbilt, who was all the rage and wanted to be able to be the first kid on the block in her neck of the woods to be able to have electrical lighting installed in her home. But with the faulty wiring systems, there were potentials for danger with fire and whatnot, and a lot of people were complaining about this, not to mention the fact that the dangling wires over the city streets were beginning to become rather problematic too. And Tesla envisioned a simpler way to do all this. Edison was not as amenable to this, but during that first meeting, he was already irked, Edison that is, because of all these failures that were being reported in his locality. Tesla shows up with a letter of recommendation from a friend, and the letter reads in part, this was from Charles Batchelor, by the way. He recommends this to Edison directly and says, "I know 2 great men, and you're one of them," talking about Edison. "The other is this young man." Edison, of course, is thinking, who is this kid? And in fact, it's rumored, I don't know if this is true, but it's rumored that upon first meeting Tesla, because of his complexion and his manner of dress, he called him Parisian, of course, because of his appearance and his dialect, and in truth, actually, Tesla spoke many languages. But it's rumored that Edison asked him, had he ever tasted human flesh? He wasn't sure where in the world he was from, and these sorts of stereotypes and things. But nonetheless, he ends up employing Tesla, gives him a little job, and quickly realizes this guy is able to put his money where his mouth is, and so he hires him. But the problem seemed to first emerge where Tesla says, look, I could go through your direct, inefficient though this system is in my mind, I can envision an alternating current system that would be better. But he says, what we could do is I could go through and I could make this system that you have, if you really are hell-bent on using that, we can make it more efficient. And Edison says to him famously, well, you can do that and I'll pay you $50,000. Not believing Tesla's going to go in there and actually do it. Tesla goes in there and does exactly what he says he's going to do. And when he asks for the money, well, unfortunately, Mr. Edison didn't want to pay up. This didn't necessarily foment a good relationship between these guys. So this was naturally the beginning of, I think, sort of a feud that occurs. Tesla is offered some pittance by Edison in terms of money. And he says, I'd rather go work the streets than be paid so little if you're not going to honor your original amount. And so Tesla does this. He leaves. He goes to work literally shoveling on the streets, and unfortunately, digging ditches, which later they're going to be putting Edison's infrastructure for direct current into. And so he had to kind of eat crow there for a while. But within a little while there, Tesla was able to put together a prototype for the alternating current motor. And this, naturally, when he presents this at age 31, it's all the rage. I mean, this is the talk of the town. Westinghouse initially was fascinated by it. They come in immediately. They purchase the patents, and also he is afforded royalties for the sale and for the further use of these. And it makes, almost overnight, Tesla one of the most wealthy men around, which, using that money rather than going out and gambling, let's keep in mind that Tesla in his early years, he did have a bit of an affinity for gambling, and also was supposed to be really good with billiards. As a young man, they said that he often would kind of spend his money away. But he invested his money a little differently after making this money off of the sale of the patents of these alternating current motors. And he immediately goes into building his new laboratory there in New York, which is directly competing with Thomas Edison. So what's kind of fascinating about these guys thereafter is not only the fact that they were creating different styles of delivery of electricity and competition in that market, but there was also the propagandization against Tesla's alternating current, which led to other innovations, namely that of the electric chair and electrocution deaths. First time it was ever used, in fact, in order to display the dangers of alternating current in a campaign against Tesla and his technology.
You know, one of the things that's always been fascinating to me about Tesla, and it's something that's almost taken on like a mythical status, is how Tesla was able to actually come up with his inventions. He actually envisioned these things in his mind, you know, in 3 dimensions, and he had such a memory for remembering objects and images and that type of thing. He could, precisely recall these things, and he could have this image in his mind for years, and then go and work and build this thing exactly as he designed it in his mind. And in contrast, Edison had a much different way of processing his inventions, or working through the process of invention. He sketched and tinkered, and would have this really messy laboratory with wires and things all over the place. And he also employed a lot of people to work on several projects simultaneously. So it was a much different process.
Yeah, Tesla even said at one point that he would watch Edison during the time that he was employed by him. He said, I'd watch Edison go about things, and he said, I would liken it to a bee looking for a needle in a haystack, and it'll go and it'll examine each individual straw of hay, whereas he said, I would think about it mathematically, and he said, with a reasonable, logical approach, I could have saved him 90% of the time that he spent trying to fumble his way through fixing things. Again, that was the beauty of Tesla's mind. But in truth, what we also saw with Tesla is a guy who had this, just a truly profound mind. The way that he said that he came upon the idea for the alternating current motor was he was walking through a park with a friend of his, and they were quoting Faust, perfectly from memory, of course, because he said at that age he could quote entire books from memory. And he said that all of a sudden it just struck him like a bolt of lightning, and he sketched in the sand the general idea for what he saw in his mind that he later created. And that, again, the alternating current motor, he said, worked perfectly exactly as he had envisioned it. Tesla just had that incredible mind, one might say like a steel trap, and it allowed him to visualize in a very unique way, which directly fed into his inventions in the years to come.
It's actually really interesting how similar the two were in a lot of ways, and how they were polar opposites. And I could see how they would oppose one another just because of the different ways that they went about things. For instance, Edison was actually a high school dropout. Equally, Tesla had dropped out of the Higher Real Gymnasium Graz University of Technology, so neither one of them really had a basis in that formal education, but yet both of them were brilliant in their own way. I think final count was just over 1,000 patents for Edison, somewhere close to 300, maybe I think 278, somewhere close to there for Tesla. So obviously Edison was working on a larger amount of projects, but Tesla was much more almost obsessive compulsive, if you will. Earlier in the show, we talked about his sleep habits, maybe 2-3 hours a night of sleep. And James, as you mentioned, he would envision these things inside of his head, almost like the blueprints were there. And they seemed to work almost flawlessly when he would go to the process of actually creating them. So Tesla himself was one of those people who was very eccentric in many, many different ways. He had certain phobias. He had certain things that he would just detest. and yet he was still able to be that consummate showman, just like we saw in the World's Fair, where the Tesla company had lighted the World's Fair and beat Edison to that contract. Edison Company of General Electric, I believe, had put in $1 million bid for lighting that year's fair, and Westinghouse with Tesla was able to do it for half of that amount, so they were awarded that contract. But it was Tesla who, at those events, was able to demonstrate the alternating current. For him to be such an obsessive, compulsive type person, he was also a consummate showman. And I think that's where he may have had a bit of an advantage over Edison, because he was able to reach people in that way. And he became this almost magician-esque, fascinating type of character.
And he still maintains that image to this day. He had an efficiency of thought, whether it was his own innovations and designs or going back over those of Edison. Tesla was the kind of person who he was able to do things efficiently, and therefore he was able to win those contracts in instances like that which you're discussing here because of the ability to be able to construct and provide with fewer material resources and yet do so in a way that produces a greater power yield. That was really, in essence, a lot of Tesla's work. And he was, again, in addition to being an efficient thinker, he was someone who, like you said, had this particular flair. You would think that Edison, I always envisioned Edison as being more like that too, but he, in fact, they said was very introverted, very sloppy. He didn't pay attention to what he was wearing. And Tesla himself in his memoirs wrote that had Edison's wife not cared for him in terms of basic hygiene, he said that the guy might have wasted away because he was so singularly involved with his work. But the other interesting thing about Edison, too, that to his credit, what he did was he kind of industrialized innovation, whereas Tesla was that mad scientist, that wizard, that master of lightning, and he was designing all this himself. You had Edison who would come up with an idea, and then he would have an assistant work on it, and then he'd have somebody else doing something. Meanwhile, he'd see something that he liked, and he would purchase a patent. Of the many thousands of patents that he owned, like you mentioned there, he'd actually purchased a lot of those. To his credit, I guess, Tesla, of the 300 or fewer that he had, those were his own innovations, whereas Edison acquired others. Edison was thinking about this, in addition to being an inventor himself and an innovator, like a businessman. And that also was one of the great divides between the two of them. Tesla, the consummate genius with a flair and a pizzazz. Edison, the tinkerer in his lab, who was hiring people to help him.
The lasting inventions from both of these guys, obviously Tesla is AC current and the AC alternating motor, and then Edison is famous for the light bulb, phonograph, moving pictures, and that type of thing. But I think the important part with Edison is those two things I just mentioned. Other people were working on those at the time, so somebody was going to invent those, really. So I think Edison's most important contribution probably is the process of invention. He had like an invention factory almost, like you mentioned. He had all these other assistants working on these other things, and he was able to kind of standardize the procedure of coming up with new devices and new inventions.
Yeah, and setting the precedent for the future of such innovation and the industrial aspect of creation and the proliferation of knowledge and technology, right up to what we see today with, again, companies like Tesla, and of course borrowing the name from the great inventor Elon Musk and others. So again, it's fascinating to see that period in history and the innovations that created. Although once again, James, I've got to dispute something you said. You said that the lasting innovation of Tesla being the alternating current and the like. I would have to say that the death ray, without question, the infamous death ray, which was disputed whether it was indeed ever created. But again, on Tesla, and I'll just say this, there was such a mystique, like Jason talked about, surrounding him, and the idea of the inventions that he had intended to create and never saw through. And there are still some mysteries about Tesla's mind and some of his inventions and some of his ideas. In fact, there are certain things I've poured through a number of his patents over the years trying to find evidence of actual designs for concepts which he discussed in magazines back in the day, like Electrical Experimenter and other popular magazines at that time. Tesla discussed a lot of things that he didn't seem to have actualized either in a lab or on print, but it's always, I think, fascinated people who are historians and people who followed the life and work of Tesla as to what he had going on up here that in his later years, perhaps, he simply wasn't able to actualize. There was probably a lot more going on there than we'll ever know.
That's a perfect point. They often talk about, as Tesla was getting older, his mind was beginning to go, and he wasn't able to focus for those long periods of time like he had done earlier in his life. again, we're looking at someone at a 24-hour cycle was only sleeping 3 hours. So he had monumental amounts of time to work on these inventions. But as he was getting older, they were beginning to slip. So there's sort of this mythos that's built up around some of the more outlandish things like the death ray that you mentioned that he may or may not have actually been involved with or researched. But it kind of added to that urban legend that is Nikola Tesla. You know, Edison was always involved in business, and even on his deathbed, he was at the time trying to champion an electric train service there in New Jersey. He died of complications from diabetes on October 18th in 1931. Again, Tesla sort of being the antithesis of that, died in New York in 1943, I believe it was, of coronary thrombosis. But he died penniless, you know, so for all the money that he had made and invested in all the great inventions that he had been integral part of, where Edison died, probably a wealthy businessman, Tesla was the exact opposite. So it builds and it lends to the story of these two characters who started together in a way, but separated and kind of became rivals, lending themselves to one of the greatest famous feuds that we've seen in the United States.
Absolutely. And, you know, I can't speak to Edison's drinking habits, but I do know that in his early days, Tesla was quite fond of coffee and apparently finally ended up swearing off of that. I think it was one vice he didn't want to have on his plate, but one that he always maintained. Fun fact about Tesla here, at least once a day, he would drink a glass of whiskey because he thought it was good for his health. He seemed to think that he seemed to think that alcohol in small quantities was far more beneficial, but nonetheless, every single day he did consume a little for his health. And guys, it's about that time I think we should head over here to the bar and pour up one. Guys, drink to your health and to the history of famous feuds like those of Edison and Tesla and the innovations that came out of them.
Here's to greatness.
Indeed. And here is to both of you and all you guys out there who tune in every week and check out our work and follow us online. Be sure and head over to 7ages.org to keep up with what the team is up to. We will hope to be in your neck of the woods somewhere very soon, as we're always taking to the road, finding new and fascinating things to explore, as we do with the subjects that we feature here on this podcast. It is the 7 Ages Audio Journal.